Now's when we get to find out who the remnant is. The remnant's here, right? So I think understanding the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is really important. If you're here on Friday night, we got to see a lot about what the American concepts of freedom were really based on. And you could see that it was a Christian principle brought to us by a Puritan pastor who became a Baptist, by the way. He was baptized, and so the Baptists claim him. Believer's baptism. Moving now, if you look at the battle and the arguments that are going on today, you have folks like the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Charlie Kirks, J.D. Vance, these folks that are advocating for some kind of a union of church and state, some kind of state religion. You have things like General Flynn saying that we need to become a Christian nation again, and that we need to have some rules to impose that, and there must be some common denominator that we can all agree on. And when you hear them arguing about that, they're arguing about that based on the secularism and the atheism that they see in the world today. And they see our freedoms as being based on that, I believe. And what they see is not freedom, they see license. Which, by the way, I think it's worthwhile to, this is a little bit of a sideline, but I think that it's worthwhile to understand what is the Catholic definition of religious liberty. Does anybody know? Can anyone state it succinctly? So they can actually state it fairly succinctly, and it goes something like this. Religious liberty is the right to do that which is right, but no right to do that which is wrong. Because that which is wrong is license, and it's not liberty. Now, when you think about it, you're all like, interesting idea. The problem with that one is, who is to determine what is right? And so for them, the magisterium and the Pope determines what is right. And so that's their thing. And so they can be big advocates for religious liberty, but if you listen very carefully, that's what they're actually advocating for. And anyway, so I don't know how I got on that sideline, other than actually I think that is what will pass as religious liberty in the future in our country, if things keep going the way they do. But the reason why is because what they look at is they look at this unfettered license that's going on. And when they see things like abortion done in the name of religious liberty, one can start to understand why they may think that, and it's a sad thing. But I think what we really need to do, and the reason why I want to do this presentation, is you'll see that the American Revolution isn't what they make it out to be. And what they're really talking about is the French Revolution. And what we're really seeing is two major powers fighting each other. And I do another presentation called Clash of the Titans. And it's like, it doesn't matter who wins, you lose. And anyway, but be that as it may, let's jump in now. The American Revolution versus the French Revolution. Well, I'm going to start talking about the American Revolution. And I want to say this about the American Revolution, is that I'm really talking about an old America, but I'm not talking about colonial America, and I'm not talking about the America that we're really living in today. I'm talking about something that has kind of passed away. Modernity has really taken its place, and modernity and postmodernism, this is really the fruits of the French Revolution, and that's a lot of what is in ascendancy here in America. I think it's important to understand two concepts. One of them is secular, and the other is atheist. And it's good to understand the difference between the two. Secular means something that is a state of being unrelated or neutral in regards to religion. Atheism is someone who completely disbelieves in the existence of God or gods. So there's a difference between them. And what passes for secular today is often actually atheism. So anyway, if you see that what's going on, you see this difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I want you to get in your mind that with the French Revolution, what you're really seeing is atheism, modernism. And if you were to talk to the people that lived in the day of the French Revolution, what was really big was philosophy. They were constantly talking about philosophy. And if you look at the Bible in Colossians 2, verse 8, it says this: "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." So the New Testament actually understood this. And why wouldn't they? Because if you look, the real basis of philosophy goes back to the Greeks. And the Greeks had already come and gone by the time the New Testament was being written. That the American Revolution is fundamentally Christian and it's fundamentally Protestant as opposed to this philosophy, right? Now, with Christianity, it's love of the truth. Jesus is the truth. The Bible says you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. That's the fundamental teaching of Protestantism. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. It's a little bit different. Now, the Bible actually exalts wisdom quite a bit. In fact, we just saw Daniel was considered the wisest man there was. But there's a difference because their wisdom, not only do they exalt wisdom, philosophy does that, but what it really is it's Greek paganism. That's the wisdom that they are exalting. And so the philosopher is really someone who is wise to the ways of Greek paganism. And it's really kind of interesting too, because if you look at, like, how many of you are familiar with Freemasonry? I see a bunch of hands here. Do you know that their high priests, they all call philosophers? That's the term they give them. And if you poke around in this long enough, you're going to see that what's really going on there is that you've got a kind of Satanist religion, and their priests go by the term philosopher. And really, okay, I bring that up, but that's not different than the French Revolution, because the French Revolution actually comes out of these same secret societies. And if you look at the French Revolution, it's the Jacobins, right? But the Jacobins are actually elevated by the Masons today. So it's all the same stuff. So anyway, enough as a preamble. Let's start talking about America and what was going on to set the stage for the American Revolution. So we talked about Roger Williams. He's in the 1640s, okay? That's a long time before the American Revolution. But fast forward 100 years and you get to George Whitefield. He was a famous American preacher, and he was a leader in the First Great Awakening. So who's George Whitefield? He's important for setting the stage for all of this. Understanding him, first of all, in the day then you had to be licensed to preach. And you would get your ministerial license, and then you could preach in the church of your denomination. Otherwise, you weren't allowed to preach. But George Whitefield came along, and guess what? He was not licensed, but he preached anyway. And he would go places, and they wouldn't let him preach. And so in Philadelphia, he was forced to speak outside. And, you know, Philadelphia doesn't have the best of weather, right? And so he was forced to preach outside, and he's moving around fast, right? But they built him a place fast, too. And so they built him a 7,000 square foot hall just for George Whitefield to preach. Somewhere I had here. Yeah, it says Whitefield reached between 75 to 80% of the entire population of the colonies. He went up and down everywhere, and he's preaching everywhere, and people are listening. This guy's important. He is critical of the established churches. He's talking to everyone. And this is a critical element of the Great Awakening. It crossed all the denominational lines. And so there was this movement of Christianity moving in America. Benjamin Franklin went to listen to George Whitefield, and this is what he said. He said, "I perceived he intended to finish with a collection, and I silently resolved that he should get nothing from me. I had in pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistoles in gold. I don't know how big a pistole is, but whatever, it was a gold coin. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give him the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. Isn't that amazing? I kind of like Franklin's way of talking. He went on to say this too. He said, if Christian preachers had continued to teach as Christ and his apostles did, without salaries, and as the Quakers now do, I imagine tests would never have existed. This is a religious test. For I think they were invented not so much to secure religion itself as the emoluments with it, or the benefits, the money. So they had these religious tests that said you had to be like, in the different colonies, in Massachusetts, you had to be a Puritan, or you couldn't do anything. If you were in another colony, it might be a different religion, and you had to be something for that, right? And they would do this to get these offices so they could make money then. And then Franklin went on to say this, when religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself, and God does not take care to support, so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil power or the government, it is a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one or a bad religion. But I should be out of my depth if I wade any deeper into theology. And so Franklin got it. If a religion needs a state support, there's something wrong here. John Jay and John Rutledge, let me see, I don't know if I want to go to them quite yet. I need to keep my notes in line with my slides. Yes. Okay, so 1774, there's the First Continental Congress. John Jay and John Rutledge are both Episcopalians from South Carolina. And this is what they described going on at the Continental Conference. It said, we were so divided in religious sentiments, some Episcopalians, some Quakers, some Anabaptists, some Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists, that it would be uncomfortable for some to join in the same act of worship. Okay, think about that for a second. Who are these people, right? Well, the Episcopalians, that's high church, right? Quakers are people that think, Quakers traditionally never called themselves Christians. Eventually they started to because they didn't like to be persecuted. But what they believed is that they just had this inner light and they were to follow that. And I'm not sure much. It's spiritualism. It's not Christianity. Like I said, most of them didn't claim it. Okay? So you got the high churchmen. You got Quakers. You got Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, these are the guys that, first you got Luther, right? And almost immediately Anabaptist comes forth. And Anabaptists believed in believers' baptism. And so really we're in that tradition here because we believe in believers' baptism. What is that? What's the difference? Well, if you're a Lutheran, when you're born, you're christened, you get your little sprinkling and every stuff, and you're a Lutheran. So within a week of being born or whatever. Same with Catholicism. Okay, Anabaptist says, no. You aren't a member of the church until you have baptism by immersion, right? So you got the high, and so they're more radical than Roger Williams eventually got baptized, so that makes him an Anabaptist, actually, okay? And then you got the Presbyterians, that's another high churchman. Congregationalists, this is low church. This is more like what Roger Williams was, you know? So look at all these people together. It'd be uncomfortable for some to join in the act of worship, right? And all these colonies have their own flavor. Sam Adams was there. I love Sam Adams. Sam Adams was called Sam the Publican. Why? Because he ran taverns in Boston. But this is interesting. He was the last of the Puritans because of his strict piety. And you're all going, what? But here's the thing. The Puritans were not opposed to drinking. They were just opposed to drunkenness. But Sam Adams says, hey, let's have prayer from an Episcopal minister. This is at the Continental Congress, right? Remember, the Episcopalians were the ones that were executing the Puritans. And so Reverend Duché, he stepped up to it. He stepped up to the plate. And let me read a little bit about what Reverend Duché did. I said, using the text of Psalms 35, the Reverend Jacob Duché instantly united the diverse religious adherents. And this is, John Adams said this, after this, Mr. Duché, unexpected to everybody, struck out into an extemporary prayer which filled the bosom of every man present. I must confess I never heard a better prayer or one so well pronounced. Sam Adams said, the lessons of that day and the prayer were read by the Reverend Mr. Duché, who afterwards made a most excellent extemporary prayer by which he discovered himself to be a gentleman of sense and piety and a warm advocate for the religious and civil rights of America. The representative from Rhode Island, Sam Ward, wrote that Mr. Duché's prayer was one of the most sublime, Catholic, by that he meant universal, well-adapted prayers I ever heard. Pennsylvania, this is the land of the Quakers, right? It's not Jose. Probably Joseph. Joseph Reed observed that Cushing and Adams never were guilty of a more masterly stroke of policy than in moving that Mr. Duché might read prayers. It had a very good effect. It says, even Quakers shed tears. One delegate declared it was worth riding 100 miles to hear. So and this wouldn't have happened without the Great Awakening with George Whitefield preaching to everybody. So just to get a flavor for what was going on in the colonies, on May of 1775, Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and humiliation. Sam Adams said this, it is upon the blessing of God alone that we must depend for the happy issue of our virtuous struggle. In June of 1776, John Adams wrote to his cousin, who was a pastor. He said this, statesmen, my dear sir, may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue, and if this cannot be inspired into our people in a greater measure than they have it now, they may change their rulers and the forms of government, but they will not obtain a lasting liberty. They will only exchange tyrants and tyrannies. You cannot, therefore, be more pleasantly or usefully employed than in the way of your profession, being a pastor, pulling down the strongholds of Satan. This is not cant, but the real sentiment of my heart. So look at these guys understood that America needed virtue. As you see what's going on, the different leaders, here's a speech from Sam Adams in Pennsylvania. It said, Americans are like the Israelites being led out of Egypt. In 1782, now this is after the Revolution, Benjamin Rush, he's one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a doctor. I believe he's the doctor that signed. He was holding a party. And let's see what it says here. Protestant Americans were now eagerly celebrating what they had long taught to hate, the French Catholic monarchy. The party, he said, they held a party to celebrate the new monarch because there had been a changing of the monarch in France. Shows us in the clearest point of view that there is no prejudice so strong, no opinion so sacred, and no contradiction so palpable that will not yield to the love of liberty. So, the Protestant Americans are holding a party to celebrate the French king. Now, I'm sure it helped that the French monarchy had helped support the revolution. But be that as it may, this is coming a long, long ways from the persecution that they'd come out of, where the Catholics were burning the Protestants as fast as they could. And we don't like to tell this part of the story. The Protestants were killing a few of the Catholics, but mainly killing Anabaptists as fast as they could. Anyway, we don't tell that part, right? In 1784, Jefferson wrote this, but our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The right of conscience we never submitted. We could not submit. We are answerable to them, to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pockets nor breaks my leg. Now remember, this is actually echoing what Roger Williams said. It doesn't matter what you believe. The magistrate is here to protect my property, protect my person, right? And so Jefferson, he really echoes that sentiment. In 1785, John Adams wrote, "When all men of all religions consistent with morals and property shall enjoy equal liberty, property, or rather security of property, and an equal chance for honors and power, and when government shall be considered as having in it nothing more mysterious or divine than other arts or sciences, we may expect that improvements will be made in the human character and in the state of society." So you can see what kind of a government we're building here. What did George Washington have to say? Well, he wrote a really famous letter that is worth reading. In 1789, George Washington wrote to the Baptists. He's writing about the Constitution. He says this: "If I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed in the convention, where I had the honor to preside, might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature to it." Now he's writing to the Baptists that were a little worried about their liberties at the moment. "And if I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. For you doubtless remember that I have often expressed my sentiment that every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience." These are powerful statements, right? By 1800, there was a presidential election. It was Jefferson versus John Adams. And it's interesting because Jefferson was opposed by the Episcopalian and the Congregationalist churches. Now think about that. That's high church and low church are actually getting together to oppose Jefferson. Why? Because they wanted a federal established church. They thought that, this is what Jefferson said. He said, they believe rightly. In other words, they believe rightly that they should oppose him. "For I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Jefferson won that election. But, these guys were friends, and in 1813, John Adams, who had lost that election, John Adams was the sitting president at the time, and then Jefferson won. But in 1813, Adams, who was also a big proponent of liberty, wrote back to Jefferson, and he says this: "Checks and balances, Jefferson, however you and your party may have derided them, are our only security for the progress of mind as well as the security of body. Every species of these Christians would persecute deists as soon as either sect would persecute another, if it had unchecked and unbalanced power. Nay, the deists would persecute Christians, and atheists would persecute deists, and as unrelenting cruelty as any Christian would persecute them or one another. Know thyself, human nature." So Adams totally got the idea of persecution, right? And so we could go on and on about the American Revolution, but I think you get the picture, okay? So with that in mind, let's go to the French Revolution. As Americans, we know a lot less about the French Revolution than the American Revolution, and so I'm going to try to get some of the basic details in. First of all, it started in May of 1789, and in August 26 of 1789, there was the Declaration of the Rights of Men. Have any of you heard of that? This is one of these things that gets mentioned, like it'll get mentioned at the UN and other kinds of stuff. There's a lot of, especially European, they really kind of hold this one out. They like this, right? Well, what is the Declaration of the Rights of Men? Well, it's interesting. It's very commonly depicted just like it is on this slide. I think this is the most common depiction that you can see of it. Does it remind you of something? Yeah, it looks a little bit like the Ten Commandments. Well, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was loosely based on the American Declaration of Independence, but I say that very loosely, right? Now, the thing you got to remember about the French Revolution is the American Revolution is some of them went over there. And there's one guy that's particularly interesting, and that's a guy named Thomas Paine. You've all heard of Thomas Paine, and you've probably had to read one of his little books. He wrote this tract that really made a big deal and really helped light the fire in the American Revolution. Interesting thing about Thomas Paine is he gets over and gets heavily involved in the French Revolution. By the time it's all done, he's viewed as just being this despicable atheist. When he comes back to America, nobody will even talk to him because of how poorly he's behaved in France. And if I remember correctly, when they buried him, I think we've even lost his grave and they've like tried to find it again. I mean, this guy went from something to truly nothing. And that I say all that to just tell you that the Americans understood that there was a difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, even though Thomas Jefferson was over there part of the time getting mired down in it and everything like that. And they kind of kept track of who was who. But enough of that. Let's go back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Here, this is like the preamble to it. It says, the representatives of the French people organized as a national assembly, believing that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of men are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of governments, have determined to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. Never did they really say, like the American Declaration of Independence, that God gave us certainly, we said that our Creator endowed us with certain unalienable rights, right? So these guys are kind of close to it, but they're not there. Listen to this. I'm just going to read a few of the things from it. One of the things they said is that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Ooh. The general good. And they're actually going to have social distinctions, right? And who gets to decide who the general good is? The aim, number two, the aim of all political association is the preservation of natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Not too different than ours. The law shall provide for such punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary, and no one shall suffer punishment except it be legally inflicted in virtue of a law passed and promulgated before the commission of the offense. Not too bad. How about this one? No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Now that's critical, the public order established by law, because, they say, well, you can exercise your rights as long as you don't exercise it to the disturbance of others, but who's going to be disturbed? It's going to be that one bigot that is so easily disturbed that, just the fact that you merely exist is enough to disturb him. Anyway, so that's 1789. 1792, the French Republic was established. In 1793, they executed the king and the Reign of Terror starts. In 1795, the Directory takes power. And in 1799, Napoleon stages a coup d'etat. It's over, basically. It's not totally over, but kind of. So let's see. Now, we read some Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Franklin about America. Let's read what the leaders of the French Revolution had to say about religion. Voltaire, very famous. He says this: every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian religion in horror. Okay, we're dealing with a different kind of revolution here. How about Diderot? Men will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Yeah, nice guys, aren't they? Here's this Baron de Holbach. He says, religion has ever filled the mind of men with darkness and kept them in ignorance of the real duties of true interests. It is only by dispelling these clouds and phantoms of religion that we shall discover truth, reason, and morality. Religion diverts us from the causes of evil and from the remedies which nature prescribes. Far from curing, it only aggravates, multiplies, and perpetuates them. How about this one? Bertrand Barrère. Let us make terror the order of the day. In 1790, there was the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And what it did, it outlawed religious practice and replaced it with the cult of the supreme being, which is a deist state religion. In 1792, they had the cult of reason, established as the official state-sponsored atheism. On August 2, 1793, and through 1794, there was something called the Genocide of La Vendée. This is considered the first modern genocide. Vendée was an area of France where there were Catholic royalists, and they killed 200,000 of them, or 25% of the population. And so on the 5th of September of 1793, the Reign of Terror starts, and Bertrand Barrère said, let's make terror the order of the day. During the Reign of Terror, there were 15,594 official death sentences, of which 2,639 were in Paris. We think an additional 10 to 12,000 people had been executed without trial, and another 10,000 died in prison. Now, these numbers don't sound that big if you compare them to things like World War II, but the population of the world was a little smaller. And these are big numbers, really. Robespierre, who became one of the main leaders of the Reign of Terror, had this to say. He said this, terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland. What an interesting justification for terror. He went on to say, true religion consists in punishing for the happiness of all those who disturb society. And so you can see what Robespierre was like. Later that year, they passed something called the Law of Suspects. This said that all priests and all persons protecting them were liable to death on the spot. The destruction of all crosses, bells, and other external signs of worship were required. They also destroyed all the statues, plaques, and iconography from the places of worship. In November of that year, they removed Sunday from the week. They changed the week so that it was 10 days long. That lasted for 2 years, and they went back to the regular week. It's interesting. The Soviets tried the same thing, and one thing that I've read when I go across, when you look, it's been said, and I think that this was true up until very recently, is that all revolutions since the French Revolution are a continuation of the French Revolution, and so all this communism, they say "Vive la Révolution," right? They're really an extension of this revolution. So it's no wonder that the Soviets decided to try to mess with the dates, with the week too. Anyway, also in November that year, they had the Fête de la Raison, which is the Party of Reason at Notre Dame Cathedral. And there you had the Goddess of Reason. She was played by Sophie Momoro. I think she was actually, I can't remember. I can't remember what she had for her profession. It wasn't too nice, but anyway. So they bring her into Notre Dame. They crown her the Goddess of Reason. Interesting is that ultimately she was imprisoned by the revolution and died in obscurity. And then 1 year later, so we started in 1793, we get to July 1794, and guess what? Robespierre has his head cut off. So you get an idea of the character of the French Revolution. Well, across the English Channel, there's a man by the name of Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is a really interesting historian / political scientist. In many ways, he's kind of the grandfather of, this is funny, they call him the grandfather of American conservatism today, but I think there's some truth to that, but I don't like it because he's really British, and he kind of was silent on the American Revolution, so it made it so the Americans we have less of one opinion or the other, but I think that we really need to be looking back at our own founding fathers for our own conservatism. But be that as it may, he was a keen observer of the French Revolution, and he had this really interesting things to say about it. And I apologize, it's kind of a long quote, but I think you'll find it worth it. He was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and this was his reply. I flatter myself that I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty, as well as any gentleman in society, but he who he will. But circumstances are what render every civil and political scheme beneficial or noxious to mankind. Is it because liberty in the abstract may be classed among the blessings of mankind, but am I seriously to felicitate a madman who has escaped from the protecting, restraint, and wholesome darkness of his cell on his restoration to the enjoyment of life and liberty? You can see where he's going. He's like, am I supposed to congratulate France, the madman, for obtaining their liberty? Am I to congratulate the highwayman and the murderer who has broke prison upon the recovery of his natural rights? I should therefore suspend my congratulations on the new liberty of France until I was informed how it had been combined with the government, with public force, with the discipline and obedience of armies, with the collection of an effective and well-distributed revenue, with morality and religion, with the solidity of property, with peace and order, with civil and social manners. You have all the advantages in your ancient states, but you chose to act as if you had never been molded into civil society, and you had everything to begin anew. You began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. Respecting your forefathers, you would have been taught to respect yourself. You would not have chosen to consider the French as a people of yesterday, as a nation of low-born, servile wretches until the emancipating year 1789. In order to furnish at the expense of your honor an excuse to your apologies here for the several enormities of yours, you would not have been content to be represented as a gang of marooned slaves suddenly broke loose from the house of bondage, and therefore to be parted. Man, there must have been a OCR involved in this. Therefore, to be pardoned for your abuse of liberty to which you are not accustomed to and ill-fitted. Justifying perfidy and murder for public benefit, so perfidy is stealing, public benefit would soon become the pretext and property and murder of the end until rapacity, malice, revenge, and fear, more dreadful than revenge, could satiate their insatiable appetite. So he says, look, you break out, you get chaos, you start stealing and murder for public benefit, and pretty soon that's all you have. Rapacity, malice, revenge, and fear of more revenge. So that's the French Revolution in a nutshell. Now, I think it's worth it to understand what really happened to America. Did we just go the way of the French? No, we didn't. I think it's good to understand what America was like in those early years after the Revolution. And for that, I go to a man named Alexis de Tocqueville. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He was a French diplomat who came to America. He came to America in 1831 to 1832, and he was very interested in what was going on. He was comparing America to Europe, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. And I highly recommend this to you to understand what America should be. This is the early America. This is the America of our founding fathers. Anyway, I don't have his quotes on the slides, so you're just going to have to listen to me read them. He said that there was, in America, a lot of religious variety, but a unified Christian morality. Here's what he said, I quote now. There are countless sects in the United States, or countless denominations. Each reveres the Creator in a different fashion, but all agree about man's duty to his fellow man. Each worships God in its own way, but all preach the same morality in God's name. Though it matters a great deal to each individual that his religion be true, this is not the case for society. Society has nothing to fear from the other and nothing to hope for. And what matters most to it is not so much that all citizens profess the true religion, as that all citizens profess some religion. In any case, all sects in the United States are encompassed within the overarching unity of Christianity, and Christian morality is the same everywhere. He said this about the clergy being involved in politics. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville was a Catholic, and he spent most of his time talking to Catholic clergy. He wasn't talking to just everybody. And this is what he said. American priests, including those who do not advocate religious liberty, generally favor civil liberty. They do not, however, support any particular political system. They are careful to remain aloof from political affairs and do not involve themselves in the machinations of the parties. Therefore, one cannot say that religion in the United States influences the laws or the specifics of political opinion, but it does shape moral attitudes, and it is by regulating the family that religion endeavors to regulate the state. Interesting insight. And so the clergy stays away from politics. But it seems like right now in America we're seeing the clergy come into politics. He saw that the home was the bedrock of the social order. And he said this, in Europe, virtually all social disorders are born at home, close to the hearth, and not far from the marriage bed. When an American leaves the discord of the political world behind and returns to the bosom of his family, he is greeted at once by an image of order and peace. There, all his pleasures are simple and natural, all his joys tranquil and innocent. That's really interesting to me. It's hard to imagine, but what was really going on in Europe that he would actually say that? But it's just very interesting is how important the home is. And yet we see that come under attack here in America just fiercely. First with the sexual revolution, but now, we're in like sexual revolution 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever 0.0 it is. It's just being attacked. And you see the natural outgrowth of that is that people are not marrying and people are not having families. And that is really not a good thing. He talks about the fact that religion is respected. He says this, but revolutionaries in America are obliged to profess certain public respect for Christian morality and equity, so that it is not easy for them to violate the laws when those laws stand in the way of their designs. Do you see that? If you're going to be a politician, it says the revolutionaries in America, these are the politicians, the people, right, that are running the show, right? They have to profess certain public respect for Christian morality. And if they violate those laws, then the people aren't going to like them. And even if they can overcome their own scruples, they would still be held in check by the scruples of their supporters. No one in the United States has yet dared to propose the maxim that everything is permitted in the interest of society. A wicked maxim that seems to have been invented in the age of liberty to legitimize all the tyrants of the future. He's rejecting the French Revolution there. But yet, look at what we're doing today. Do we really have scruples that we reject our leaders for their improprieties? It seems like we've gone a long ways. I remember when I was younger, we still did some, but it seems like now there's nothing. He says that Christianity is the liberty for Americans. He says this, Americans so completely confound Christianity with liberty that it is almost impossible to induce them to think of one without the other. Wow, do you hear that? That's not today, is it? For them, moreover, this is by no means a sterile belief, a legacy of the past that lives smoldering in the depths of the soul, but a vital article of faith. They confound Christianity with liberty. It's a beautiful thing. He goes on to say, the philosophers of the 18th century had a very simple explanation for the gradual continuation of religious belief. Religious virtue, they said, was bound to dwindle as liberty and enlightenment increased. In Europe, the unbelief of certain segments of the population is rivaled only by their ignorance. Whereas in America, we find one of the freest and most enlightened peoples in the world zealously observing all of religion's outward requirements. So he's saying, look, the top class in Europe rejects religion, but the top class in America at least observes the outward requirements. He goes on to say, in France, I know the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty almost always pulled in opposite directions. In the United States, I found them intimately intertwined. Together, they ruled the same territory. Talking about church, separation of church and state, he said, in order to learn more about it, I questioned the faithful of all communions. To each of them I expressed my astonishment and revealed my doubts, and I discovered that they differed among themselves only on matters of detail. To a man they assigned a primary credit for the peaceful ascendancy of religion in their country, to the complete separation of church and state. I state without hesitation that during my stay in America I met No, not one, not a single clergyman or layman who did not agree with that statement. Wow. Universal agreement that we need separation of church and state. He says this, as long as religion rests solely on the sentiments that console man in his misery, you can win the affection of the human race. But when it embraces the bitter passions of this world, it may be forced to defend allies acquired through interest rather than love. And it must reject its adversaries, men who love it still, even as they battle with its allies. Religion cannot share the material made of those who govern without incurring some of the hatred they inspire. So what he's saying is that if you start to bring religion together with the state, you're going to make political allies. And then you're going to have to fight for your ally, whether you agree with them or not. And that's why I think that we tried to make it a point in Seventh-day Adventism to keep politics out of the pulpit. And the sad thing is that what's really going on right now is that there is a certain element of politics just in talking about religious liberty at all. It's because in our country we've gone down a road so far down the road of Marxism, which is completely antithetical to liberty, that to ask for liberty puts you at odds with that. But I digress too far. Let's continue to talk about what Alexis de Tocqueville had to say. He said this, as a nation's social state becomes increasingly democratic and as societies lean toward republican forms, it becomes increasingly dangerous for religion to join forces with authority. For power will soon pass from hand to hand. One political theory will replace another, and men, laws, and constitutions themselves or vanish or change from one day to the next, not just for a while, but constantly. Agitation and instability are inherent in the nature of a democratic republic, just as stasis and slumber are the rule in absolute monarchies. He goes on to say, unbelievers in Europe pursue Christians as though they were political enemies rather than religious adversaries. They hate faith as though it were a party opinion rather than an erroneous belief. In Europe, Christianity allowed itself to become the close ally of temporal powers. Today, these powers are collapsing, and Christianity finds itself buried, as it were, beneath the debris. A living thing, it has been roped to cadavers. Cut the ties that bind to the dead, and it will rise again. So he's talking about the monarchies of the cadavers, and Christianity is bound to it. Talking about respect for others' political opinions, he said this, as I listened to, I also learned that in God's eyes, no one is damnable for his political views so long as those views are sincere, and that there is no more sin in erring about matters of government than being mistaken about how to build a house or plow a furrow. It's really interesting because nowadays, if you got the wrong politics, you end up being pretty much damned for everything, don't you? He has this to say about the state of religion in Europe. Why does this picture not apply to us? Among us, I see men who have ceased to believe in Christianity without embracing any other religion. I see others who are stuck in doubt and pretend they no longer believe. Still others are Christians who continue to believe, but they don't admit it. So, what a different world. And how does that apply to today? What's the legacy of the French Revolution? What's the legacy of the American Revolution? Well, I feel, man, so much has changed. Even in this last year, you get to see how America, last few months, how America turns out to be the author of so much of the unrest that's around the world. But I would say this, is that the French Revolution is the author of the unrest. It's the author of so many things that we see going around the world that's just, it's just a problem. And yet it goes by the name of freedom. And it goes by the name of liberty. It goes by the name of democracy. But it's so interesting because lately we've heard that democracy really means, according to some of our dear leaders, that it means democratic institution. And have you noticed how in America now the word populism has become evil? But populism is just another word for democracy. Now, we can argue about if democracy is a good thing or not. We have a Republican form of government, right? However, it's a democratic republic. And so, I don't know. They're all intertwined in our system of government. What do we have? America, I say, is transitioning to the atheism of the French Revolution. And you see the religious liberty today that is often advocated for is actually based on the theories of the French Revolution. You see that the idea rights come from the state. The American Revolution is rights come from God. In the American Revolution, human beings have rights and we come together to form societies. And as we come together to form societies, we see the efficiency in surrendering some of our rights to the state so that the state can manage things like the police power, protection from foreign enemies, these sorts of things. Under the French Revolution model, it's really actually based on the old Catholic model. The French Revolution would say that the rights come from the state, and the state will grant certain rights. And they'll get together and vote, but you find out that some people are more equal than others and get more of a vote to see who gets what rights, right? But really, this is just washed over repeat from the older European model, which is you have God, the Pope, and the King. And the King and the Lords to the people. And rights all trickle down. Now, with some of the Reformation, we got rid of the Pope out of that, but we still kept the King, and we went God, King, nobles, people. But it's a different model. The American model is very much, we are made in the image of God. But we see this leaking over into our own talk about religious liberty. And this is one of the things that really bothers me. You can see some religious liberty advocates will advocate for the idea that abortion is a religious liberty right. But really what they're doing is they're embracing atheism because they can't find a reason for not killing. And because they can't find that reason without going to the Bible, they say we have to be divorced from the Bible. And when we're divorced from the Bible, the natural outcome is abortion. But the real natural outcome is the French Revolution, which is the destruction of religion and terror ruling the day. And so we see now this fight going on, and the Supreme Court has finally started to shift into a new direction. And so the Supreme Court is now rejecting the principles of the French Revolution. You see with this Dobbs decision, and we're seeing it in other places. But the question then becomes, where does that pendulum swing to? And I don't have an answer for you. I believe what we're called to do is to teach true religious liberty. To teach the religious liberty of Roger Williams, teaching about the doctrine of two tables. It's true. It's a good doctrine. Liberty itself, though, is not the solution. Edmund Burke had to say that. And so really the only way that you can have a free, good society is the George Whitefield model, right? The Great Awakening. But we read prophecy, do we not? And we know that that is not the model that we're facing, but rather I think we're going to be facing this model. And so, we need to remember, virtue only comes from Christianity. Virtue can never come from the state. Combining church and state is not going to bring virtue back. And all it's really going to do is lead to persecution. And that's the world we're going to live in, I'm afraid. And so we have the hard work to do of evangelism to be like Whitfield's. This is momentous times we live in. But we need to stand for the truth. We need to be able to give accurate histories, and we can have a reason for our belief when we meet the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Charlie Kirks, the J.D. Vances, the General Flynns of the world. And I will say this, I really do believe this, that the coming strife that we're going to face, the power of evil, the power that's the beast power, the power that's Antichrist, is going to be attractive. And the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Charlie Kirks, and these are appealing, especially in the face of the comparison between them and the French Revolution. And so we have to be prepared to stand firm. We have to have a reason for our faith. We have to give a reason for our faith. And for that, we return to what I spoke about this morning, which is prophesy again. And so with that, I just admonish you, keep the faith. Always have a reason. Be instant in season, out of season. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for all of the knowledge that you've given us. I thank you for the prophecy that you've given us so that we can see how we fit in and that we can see clearly truth from error. Lord, I pray that you'll make us into good witnesses. Teach us how to stand for you. We know that the time of no religious liberty is coming soon. Lord, I just ask that we would be making as good use of the time that we have now, and that we also would develop the characters that we would be able to stand for you during times of persecution. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.